The bullet tore through the air like a streak of lightning, slamming into the girl's chest with a force that knocked her off her feet. Her body crumpled onto the cold pavement, arms sprawled out, eyes wide with shock and pain. A choked gasp escaped her lips, blood bubbling at the corners of her mouth as her breath hitched. Officer Daniel Cross stood frozen, his gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His pulse pounded in his ears. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. No more flickering streetlights, no more distant hum of the city, no more sirens wailing in the night. Just him, and the girl bleeding out on the cracked concrete. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, someone rushing toward them. His instincts screamed at him to raise his gun again, to take control of the situation. But then he saw who it was. Mayor William Sloan. The man known for his iron will and sharp tongue was running toward the girl, his daughter. His face was twisted in horror. Cross's heart stopped, his throat went dry. Then the mayor let out a scream. A sound that would haunt Cross for the rest of his life. It had started as a routine patrol. That's what Cross would tell himself later. Just another night in Brookstead, a city that had been changing too fast for his liking. The new mayor, William Sloan, had been pushing for reforms, talking about cleaning up corruption in the police force, bringing in fresh leadership, making things fair. To Cross, it was all just political nonsense. It didn't change the reality on the ground. He'd been a cop for 20 years. He knew how the city worked. Some people didn't belong in certain places, and it was his job to make sure they stayed in their lane. That's why, when he saw the girl walking through the gates of Langford Park after hours, he didn't think twice. A black girl, alone, in a private park. It didn't add up. Cross hit the brakes hard, his patrol car screeching to a stop. His fingers twitched over the grip of his gun. The city had been on edge lately. Protests, complaints against officers, people filming everything with their damn phones. He wasn't about to take chances. "Hey you!" he barked, stepping out of the vehicle. "You can't be here." The girl turned. She was young, maybe 16 or 17. She wore a hoodie, dark jeans, sneakers. Nothing about her looked threatening. But Cross had seen enough to know that trouble didn't always dress the part. She didn't look scared, though, and that set him off immediately. "I said you can't be here." He stepped closer. "I'm just passing through," she said, calm, like she didn't have a care in the world. Cross narrowed his eyes. "Not your park. Turn around." "I don't have to," she replied. "This is a public space." Cross's jaw tightened. He didn't like being talked back to, especially by people like her. "This park is private property after dark," he snapped. "That means you're trespassing." She sighed, like she was dealing with a child. "I live right down the street. My dad is—" "I don't care who your dad is," Cross cut in. "Step back." Then she did something that made his blood boil. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Like she had the upper hand. Like she wasn't afraid of him. Cross clenched his teeth. He had dealt with this before. Kids who thought they were untouchable, who thought the rules didn't apply to them. And every time, he made sure they learned otherwise. "I'm going to ask you one last time," he said, his voice low. "Turn around. Put your hands where I can see them." The girl sighed again and reached into her pocket. That's when everything went red. Cross's instincts took over. He didn't wait to see what she was pulling out. He didn't wait to ask questions. His training kicked in, the same training that had been drilled into him for years. Threat detected. Neutralize immediately. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence. The girl jerked backward, her legs giving out beneath her. Something small and shiny slipped from her fingers, landing on the ground with a soft clink. A phone. Cross stared at it, his breath coming in short gasps. A phone. Not a weapon. Not a gun. Oh God. His heart pounded as the weight of what he had done settled over him. He had just shot an unarmed girl. A girl who had been smiling at him just moments ago. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Pounding against the pavement. A voice, deep, frantic, desperate, roared through the night. Cross turned just in time to see a man charging toward them, his suit flapping behind him, his eyes wild with terror. It took him a second to recognize the face. Mayor William Sloan. Cross's stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. The girl on the ground wasn't just anyone. She was the mayor's daughter, and he had just shot her. The world seemed to slow down. The mayor dropped to his knees beside his daughter, shaking her, his hands pressing against the bleeding wound in her chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale with shock. Cross took a step back, his gun still in his hand. His mind raced. His training told him to secure the scene, to call it in, to take control of the situation. But this wasn't a situation. This was a disaster. The mayor's hands were slick with blood as he cradled his daughter's face. "Stay with me, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay with me." Cross's mouth opened, but no words came out. The girl coughed weakly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at her father, confusion flickering in her gaze. "Dad?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," William Sloane said, his voice hoarse. "I'm right here." Cross's grip tightened on his gun. He had to think, had to act. There were no cameras around, no witnesses, except the mayor. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe he could say she reached for something, make it look justified. But then, a light flickered from the darkness of the park. A soft glow. Cross's stomach dropped. Someone had been filming. His head snapped toward the trees. A figure stood near the edge of the park, barely visible in the shadows, holding up a phone. Cross couldn't see their face, but he saw the red blinking light. They were still recording. His breath caught in his throat. He was screwed. And then, the sirens. They started distant, a low wail, but grew louder, cutting through the night like a death knell. Blue and red lights flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the blood-stained pavement. William Sloane was still kneeling beside his daughter, his expensive suit now smeared with her blood. His hands trembled as he pressed down on her wound, desperate to keep her with him. Cross's heart pounded, his mind raced. He was a cop. He knew exactly how this would play out. The second those officers arrived, the questions would start. The report would have to be filed. And that video, whoever was recording, if that got out, his career, his freedom, maybe even his life as he knew it, gone. He had to think fast. His fingers clenched around his gun. One bullet. If he could just... "Don't you dare." Sloane's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. Cross froze. The mayor's eyes burned with fury. His face was twisted in pure rage. "Put the gun down. Now." His voice was low. Dangerous. For a split second, Cross thought about running. He could bolt into the trees, disappear before the other officers got here. Say he was attacked, that he had no choice. But before he could act, the first police car screeched to a stop behind him. Doors slammed, officers rushed out, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapon. Hands in the air." Cross snapped back to reality. They weren't aiming at some suspect in the dark. They were aiming at him. His pulse spiked. He was one of them. A fellow officer. But the way they looked at him, the way their fingers tensed over their triggers, he realized in an instant that he wasn't safe. Not anymore. Slowly, he raised his hands. His gun slipped from his grip, clattering onto the pavement. The officers moved in fast. One of them, Sergeant Serena Holt, shoved him hard against his own patrol car. His face smacked the cold metal. "Don't move," she hissed in his ear, yanking his arms behind his back. Cross gritted his teeth. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one giving orders, the one in control. Not this. Not this. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. His eyes darted toward the mayor. Sloane hadn't moved from his daughter's side. Paramedics were surrounding her now, working fast, checking her pulse. Their voices were urgent, a blur of medical jargon and frantic commands. Cross saw the girl's lips move. She was alive. Barely. His stomach twisted. If she survived, if she talked. No. His gaze shifted toward the trees. The figure with the phone was still there, still recording. His heart dropped. That video was the end of him. But before he could do anything, before he could even think, another cop grabbed him and dragged him toward a squad car. The world was spinning. He barely had time to process what was happening before he was shoved inside. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the back seat, like a common criminal. His breath came fast. Sweat dripped down the back of his neck. He had to get out of this. He had to turn this around. But then, a sound, a voice. The voice of the mayor. "You're gonna rot for this, Cross." Cross turned his head. His eyes met William Sloane's through the car window. The look the mayor gave him sent a chill straight through his bones, and that's when he knew. This wasn't just a bad night. This was the beginning of his end. Hours earlier, before the gunshot, before the sirens, before the chaos, she had only wanted to take a walk. Maya Sloan wasn't the kind of girl who got into trouble. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to sneak out or break the rules. But tonight, she needed to breathe. She needed to think. She needed to get away from the pressure of being the mayor's daughter. Her father, William Sloan, had been running the city for 2 years now, and it felt like every moment of her life was being watched. Every time she stepped outside, there were whispers, eyes on her, people expecting something from her. So she walked. Langford Park was close to home. She had been there a million times before. It was peaceful at night, the kind of place where she could clear her head. She wasn't expecting trouble. She definitely wasn't expecting a cop to roll up on her like she was some kind of criminal. When the patrol car screeched to a stop, her first instinct was confusion, then annoyance. Then, when the cop stepped out and barked at her, anger. She had seen his type before. The kind who looked at her like she didn't belong. The kind who assumed things about her before she even opened her mouth. Maya knew her rights. She knew she wasn't doing anything wrong. But none of that mattered, because when she reached for her phone, everything changed. In an instant, the cop didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't even give her a second to explain. He just shot her. The pain was like fire, like lightning ripping through her chest. She hit the ground, her body screaming in agony, her mind spinning. She heard his footsteps, felt the cold pavement beneath her, saw the distant glow of a phone recording. And then, her father's voice. Everything else faded, everything else disappeared. "Dad," she tried to say more, but her body was shutting down. The pain was too much. She felt herself slipping. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the look of pure terror on her father's face. Maya Sloan had spent her whole life under a microscope. Everywhere she went, people watched her. Every time she stepped outside, she could feel the whispers, expectations pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. That was life when your father was William Sloan, the mayor of Brookstead. 2 years in office, and already his name was everywhere. Some people called him a reformer, others called him a threat. But to Maya, he was just Dad. That night, she needed air, space, a moment away from the eyes, the pressure, the weight of being his daughter. So she walked. Langford Park was close to home. She'd been there a million times before. It was peaceful at night, the kind of place where she could clear her head. She wasn't expecting trouble. She definitely wasn't expecting a cop to roll up on her like she was some kind of criminal. When the patrol car screeched to a stop, her first instinct was confusion, then annoyance. Then, when the cop stepped out and barked at her, anger. She knew his type. The kind who looked at her like she didn't belong. The kind who assumed things about her before she even opened her mouth. She knew her rights. She knew she wasn't doing anything wrong. But none of that mattered. Because when she reached for her phone, everything changed. The cop didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't even give her a second to explain. He just pulled the trigger. The pain was like fire, like lightning ripping through her chest. She hit the ground, her body screaming in agony, her mind spinning. She heard his footsteps, felt the cold pavement beneath her, saw the distant glow of a phone recording, and then her father's voice. Everything else faded. Everything else disappeared. "Dad." She tried to say more, but her body was shutting down. The pain was too much. She felt herself slipping. And the last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the look of pure terror on her father's face. Now, inside the squad car, Daniel Cross stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. This wasn't over. Not yet. He could still fix this. The back door of the squad car suddenly yanked open. Cross turned, expecting another officer. But it wasn't a cop. It was William Sloan, and the look in his eyes sent a cold, sharp blade of fear straight through Cross's chest. The mayor stepped forward, leaned in close. His voice was low, dangerous. "You have no idea what's coming for you." Then, he slammed the door shut. Cross swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. Cross sat stiff in the back seat, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The mayor's words echoed in his head. "You have no idea what's coming for you." This wasn't just an officer-involved shooting. This wasn't just another case of a cop pulling the trigger and getting away with it. This was personal. He had shot the mayor's daughter. And now, as the squad car pulled away from the scene, he realized something chilling. He wasn't walking away from this. No cover-up, no union backing him up, no smooth-talking lawyer spinning the story in his favor. No. This time, he was screwed. The car rumbled through the darkened streets. The flashing lights cast eerie patterns on the buildings. Cross tried to slow his breathing, tried to think. There had to be a way out of this. His mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe the mayor was bluffing. Maybe this was just heat-of-the-moment rage. Maybe by the time they got to the station, the usual process would play out. Paid leave. An investigation that led nowhere. A press conference with carefully chosen words like unfortunate and tragic. But deep down, Cross knew better. Something about the way Sloan had looked at him, the raw hatred in his eyes, made Cross's skin crawl. This wasn't just another case. This was war. Maya Sloan was fighting for her life. Surgeons worked frantically, their hands moving with urgency, trying to repair the damage. The bullet had torn through her left lung, barely missing her heart. She had lost a lot of blood. Too much. Outside the emergency room, William Sloan stood motionless, staring through the glass window, his daughter. His baby girl. Inside that room, clinging to life, because of a man who had sworn to serve and protect. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. It didn't matter what the police report would say. It didn't matter how they tried to spin this. Cross had shot her without hesitation. Sloan had seen the footage. Someone had sent it to him before the cops even had a chance to suppress it. The shaky video, taken from the shadows, showed everything. The way Maya had barely moved before Cross pulled the trigger. The way she had crumpled to the ground, blood spilling from her chest. The way Cross had stood over her, gun still raised, like she was nothing. William Sloan had seen a lot in his time as mayor. Corruption, greed, injustice. But nothing had ever ignited a fire in his chest like this. Cross had taken the wrong shot. And now, Sloan was going to make sure he paid for it. Cross's hands were slick with sweat. His mind raced, scrambling for a plan. He couldn't just sit there, handcuffed in the back of the squad car, waiting to be booked like some low-life criminal. No. They were going to make an example of him. The media would devour this story. Racist cop shoots unarmed black girl. He knew how these things played out. Once the public got involved, once the outrage spread, there was no stopping it. He had to get ahead of this. He had to control the story. Then, the car took a sharp turn. Cross frowned. They weren't heading toward the station. Something wasn't right. He leaned forward, straining to see through the windshield. The streetlights blurred past, unfamiliar buildings flashing by. This wasn't the way to the precinct. He swallowed hard. Hey, where the hell are we going? The cop driving, Sergeant Serena Holt, didn't answer. Neither did Officer Daniels, sitting stiffly in the passenger seat. Cross's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Hey, I'm talking to you. His voice rose, edged with panic. Where are you taking me? Holt's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. Cold, unrateable. You'll see. Flat, final. Cross's pulse skyrocketed. He yanked at the door handle. Locked. His whole body tensed. He was a cop. He knew what this looked like. They weren't taking him to the station. They were taking him somewhere else. Somewhere no cameras would see. Somewhere no rules applied. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Cross knew what it felt like to be truly afraid. The waiting room was packed. Reporters, city officials, police officers, community leaders. The air was thick with silence, heavy with tension. The news had spread like wildfire. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Protesters held up signs. Say her name, Maya Sloan. Justice for Maya. No more killer cops. The pressure was building. And inside, standing motionless, fists clenched, William Sloan stared through the glass window of the emergency room. His daughter, his baby girl. Fighting for her life. Because of a man who had sworn to protect and serve. A voice pulled him back to the present. Sir, Sloan turned. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stood beside him. Adrian Voss. A name that struck fear into men like Daniel Cross. Voss wasn't just anyone. He was the kind of man who handled things. Sloan exhaled slowly. You saw the video? Voss nodded once. Sloan's voice was deadly quiet. Voss's lips pressed into a thin line. I have men watching every officer in that precinct. A pause. They're moving Cross now. Sloan's jaw tightened. He won't make it to booking. Voss's voice was steady. They're taking him somewhere off the grid. Sloan inhaled deeply. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, make sure he understands exactly what he did. Voss nodded once. Consider it done. Sloane turned back toward the glass, watching the doctors work on his daughter. His heart was heavy. His rage was cold. Tonight, Daniel Cross had learned what it felt like to be powerless. But by the time this was over, he would learn what it felt like to pay. Cross's breath came in ragged gasps. The squad car sped through the dark, unfamiliar streets. His mind screamed at him. This isn't protocol. They weren't taking him to the station. They weren't booking him. This was something else. Something worse. He struggled against the handcuffs, the cold metal biting into his wrists. "Where the hell are we going?" he demanded, his voice laced with fear. Holt didn't answer. Neither did Daniels. They just kept driving. Cross's pulse pounded in his ears. He'd been a cop long enough to recognize the feeling creeping up his spine. This was a setup, a hit, and he was the target. His throat went dry. "Holt," he forced his voice to stay controlled. "You can't do this. You know that, right?" Holt's hands gripped the wheel tighter. Her knuckles went white. Still, no answer. Daniels, usually the loudmouthed, easygoing type, sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Cross's panic deepened. He knew Holt. Knew she was the kind of cop who always played by the rules. So why the hell was she going along with this? Then it hit him. This wasn't just about Maya Sloane. This was bigger. William Sloane was making a statement. Cross had been in the department long enough to know the dirty secrets that ran through Brookstead. He had always thought he was untouchable, that the system would protect him, no matter what. But now he was the example. He had shot the mayor's daughter, and they were making sure he paid for it. The car turned sharply, jolting Cross to the side. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of a rusted chain-link fence. Beyond it, an abandoned industrial area. His stomach twisted. They weren't just taking him off the books, they were taking him off the map. He had to act. Now, his mind snapped into survival mode, because the second that car stopped, he was dead. Cross wasn't going out like this. He'd fight, kick, bite, do whatever it took to break free. He wasn't about to just disappear into some unmarked grave, not without a fight. The squad car screeched to a halt. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the back door swung open. Blinding light poured in, making him squint as a shadowy figure stepped forward, silhouetted against the headlights. His vision adjusted, and his blood turned to ice. It wasn't just anyone. It was Adrian Voss, the mayor's enforcer, the man who handled problems that couldn't be solved with politics. Cross's pulse skyrocketed. His mouth went dry as Voss leaned down, his massive frame filling the doorway. His voice was low, almost casual. "Get out." Cross's body locked up. He knew what happened to people who got dragged to places like this. They disappeared. Forever. He swallowed hard. "No." The word barely escaped his lips. Voss smirked. "Wrong answer." Before Cross could react, a fist slammed into his ribs, pain exploding through his torso. He doubled over, gasping for air, but rough hands grabbed him, yanking him out of the car. His knees hit the dirt hard, shockwaves of pain shooting up his legs. He tried to get up, but another blow cracked across his face, snapping his head to the side. Blood pooled in his mouth, metallic and thick. He spat onto the ground, vision spinning. Voss crouched in front of him, dark eyes cold and unfeeling. "You like shooting kids, huh?" His voice was soft, almost mocking. Cross wheezed, trying to speak. "I..." A sharp kick to his stomach sent him sprawling, his body convulsed from the impact, agony radiating through every nerve. Voss sighed like he was disappointed. "See, I was hoping you'd fight back, would have made this more fun." Cross coughed, struggling to breathe. A few feet away, Holt and Torres stood motionless, watching, not stopping it, not helping him, letting it happen. Voss grabbed a fistful of Cross's hair, yanking his head up so their faces were inches apart. His voice was a deadly whisper. "Maya Sloane is fighting for her life in that hospital because of you." His grip tightened. "You didn't hesitate, didn't even think twice before pulling that trigger." His breath was hot against Cross's ear. "So tell me, Cross, how does it feel to be on the other side?" Cross's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He could barely breathe. His body shook, his ribs screaming in agony. Voss leaned in closer. "You're done," he whispered. "You just don't know it yet." Then, just like that, he let go. Cross collapsed onto the dirt, his vision flickering in and out. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Holt's voice. "That's enough." Voss chuckled. "You getting soft on me, Sergeant?" Holt didn't answer. Cross lay still, body screaming in pain. He had to find a way out of this. He had to. Then, bang! A gunshot ripped through the air. Cross's body tensed. Then a second shot. A third. Chaos erupted. Taurus shouted something. Holt cursed. Voss spun, reaching for his gun. More shots. Cross barely had time to process what was happening before darkness swallowed him whole. Cross's mind flickered like a dying light bulb. Sound warped in and out. Shouted voices, hurried footsteps, the distant echo of gunfire. His body screamed in pain, but his brain struggled to keep up. 1 second, he was on the ground, barely breathing. The next, gunshots. Then chaos. His eyes fluttered open. The world swam around him in a haze of red and black. Figures moved, shadows darting between the flickering headlights. Voss had his gun out, barking orders. Taurus slumped against the car, his body limp. Holt, where was Holt? Cross tried to move, but agony ripped through his ribs. His body wouldn't listen. Then, more gunfire. Close, too close. Something thudded to the ground near him. A body. His breath hitched. He forced his head to turn, his vision sharpening just enough to see. Voss, sprawled on the dirt, blood pooling beneath him, dead. Cross's heart slammed against his ribs. What the hell just happened? A shadow loomed over him. His breath caught. He braced for another hit, for more pain. But the figure crouched down instead. A voice. Calm, familiar. Get up. Cross's eyes focused. Holt. Her expression was stone cold, her gun still raised. Cross blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. What? He choked out. Holt didn't answer. She reached down, grabbed his arm, and yanked him to his feet. Pain exploded through his ribs, but fear overrode it. Cross swayed, body weak, thoughts tangled. What the hell just happened? He gasped. Holt scanned the area. Taurus wasn't moving. Voss was dead. Who had fired first? Cross's pulse pounded. He was sure it wasn't him. Holt's jaw was tight. We don't have time for this, she snapped. We need to move. Cross's brain still wasn't working at full speed. Move where? He asked, staggering. Holt's grip on her gun tightened. Somewhere the mayor's people can't find you. Cross froze. Her words hit like a sledgehammer to his skull. She wasn't supposed to be helping him. She was supposed to be finishing him. What the hell was happening? Cross staggered forward, barely able to keep up. His legs felt like lead, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his ribs. His head spun, his body barely holding together, but Holt didn't slow down. She gripped his arm tight, practically dragging him through the maze of abandoned warehouses and crumbling industrial buildings. Behind them, sirens screamed through the night. More cops, more of Sloane's people. If they caught him now, he wouldn't make it out alive. He forced himself to push forward, every breath a knife in his side. Where the hell are we going? He rasped. Holt didn't answer. She didn't slow down, didn't even look at him. Cross's mind was a mess. Why was she doing this? Just an hour ago she had been ready to throw him in a cage. Now she was leading him away from the bodies, away from the mayor's wrath. Why? He wasn't stupid. No one helped a man like him out of the kindness of their heart. Holt had an angle, and he needed to figure out what it was, fast. They reached a rusted-out chain-link fence. Holt stopped, scanning their surroundings before crouching down. She yanked up a loose section of the fence and motioned for him to crawl through. He hesitated. She shot him a look. You can die here if you want, she snapped. That was all the motivation he needed. Gritting his teeth, Cross dropped to the ground and dragged himself through the gap. His arms shook with the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. The second he was on the other side, Holt followed, letting the fence fall back into place. They were behind another warehouse now, the city lights a distant glow on the horizon. Cross collapsed against the wall, gulping in air. His chest burned, his vision swam. He was running on fumes. Holt stood over him, her expression unreadable. Cross wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hand coming away smeared with blood. He swallowed hard. Okay, he wheezed. You gonna tell me what the hell is going on? Holt crossed her arms. You're dead, Cross. He blinked, confused. What? You are dead, she repeated, her voice sharp, final. That's what everyone is going to think. Cross stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. His stomach dropped. They weren't escaping, she was disappearing him. His heart slammed against his ribs. No, he said, shaking his head. Hell no, I'm not just going to disappear. You don't have a choice. Cross pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain in his body. Like hell I don't, he snapped. I'm a cop. I have rights. I can fight this. Holt let out a short, humorless laugh. You think Sloane's gonna let you stand trial? You think this is about justice? She shook her head. No, Cross. He doesn't want you behind bars. He wants you gone. Cross clenched his jaw. She was right. If the mayor had his way, he'd never make it to a courtroom. He'd end up in a ditch somewhere, his body never found. And now Holt had just given him one way out, faking his death, starting over, running. Cross swallowed hard, his throat dry. Why are you doing this? He asked, watching her closely. Holt's expression darkened. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm doing this because I know how this city works. If the mayor takes you out, it won't stop there. It'll set a precedent. Cops disappearing. Justice handled in the shadows. Her jaw tightened. I won't let that happen. Cross exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. He didn't trust her. Not fully. But right now, she was his only way out. His only shot at surviving this mess. All right, he muttered, leaning back against the wall. His head was spinning. He needed to think. Holt checked her watch. We don't have long before they find the bodies. We need to move. Cross looked up at her. There was one thing still bothering him. What about Taurus? Holt didn't answer right away. Then, he's dead. Cross felt a chill crawl up his spine. Dead. Just like Voss. His voice was low. Did you? Holt cut him off. Does it matter? Cross stared at her. A few hours ago, Holt had been just another cop. Someone he worked with. Someone he thought he understood. But now he wasn't sure who the hell she really was, or if he could trust her at all. Still, he didn't have a choice. Not anymore. Holt turned, motioning for him to follow. Come on. Cross exhaled slowly. Then, he pushed off the wall and walked into the darkness. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for sure. His old life was over, and something far worse was waiting for him. Cross followed Holt through the darkened streets, every step sending fresh jolts of pain through his battered body. His ribs ached, his face throbbed, and his mind felt like it was teetering on the edge of shutting down. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when every cop in the city was either looking to arrest him or, worse, bury him. They moved quickly, slipping through alleyways, cutting across abandoned lots. The industrial district gave way to crumbling brick buildings and flickering streetlights, the kind of neighborhood where people knew better than to ask questions. Finally, Holt stopped in front of a rusted metal door, wedged between two boarded-up shops. She pulled out a key and shoved it into the lock. Cross hesitated. What is this? He asked, eyeing the door warily. Holt glanced over her shoulder. A safe house, she said. At least for now. Cross's jaw tightened. For who? Holt didn't answer. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Cross hesitated for half a second before following. The place was barely more than a single room. Concrete walls, a sagging couch, a table with an old laptop on it, a small bathroom in the corner, its door slightly ajar. It was clear the place had been used before. Holt closed the door behind them, locking it with a heavy click. Then she exhaled, rubbing her forehead. Cross sat down heavily on the couch, wincing as his ribs protested. You gonna tell me the plan now? He asked. Holt leaned against the table, arms crossed. You don't have a plan, Cross? She said flatly. You're dead, remember? Cross scowled. I'm still breathing. For now. Silence stretched between them. Cross exhaled sharply. I need to know why you're doing this, he said. You could have handed me over. Hell, you should have. Holt studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke. I know what it's like to have the system turn against you. Cross frowned. What are you talking about? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. You remember Jamal Harris? Cross blinked. The name was familiar. Then it hit him. The shooting. A kid. Black. Unarmed. Gunned down by a cop in what was later called a misunderstanding. The officer claimed self-defense. No charges were filed. Just another name on the growing list of people killed by police. Cross had barely paid attention to the case back then, but now, seeing the way Holt's expression hardened, it clicked. You knew him, he said. Holt's eyes flashed. He was my nephew. Cross felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth, but Holt cut him off. You want to know why I'm doing this? She said, her voice sharp. Because I've seen how this city works. I've seen what happens when the wrong people get killed and the right people walk away. She leaned forward, her gaze drilling into him. You thought you were one of the right people, didn't you? Cross clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what to say. Holt shook her head. Sloane's gonna tear this city apart looking for you, she said. You think people hate cops now? Wait until that video goes public. Cross tensed. The video, his pulse spiked. Who has it? He asked. Holt narrowed her eyes. You mean, who's going to release it? Cross swallowed hard. I need to know. Holt let out a dry laugh. Why? So you can try to stop it? Cross didn't answer, because the truth was, yes. If that video got out, there was no coming back. No union lawyer could spin it. No department PR statement could clean it up. It would be the end of him. Holt must have seen something in his expression because her stare turned cold. That video is the only thing keeping you alive, she said. Cross frowned. What are you talking about? Holt leaned back. Think about it. If you just disappeared, Sloane wouldn't need to justify anything. He could blame it on the streets. Say someone got revenge. Case closed. Cross's breath hitched. But with the video, Holt continued, with people watching, Sloane can't just erase you. He has to be careful. Cross exhaled slowly. She was right. If the video got released, Sloane wouldn't be the only one after him. The whole damn city would be. Cross ran a hand down his face, his pulse pounding. He needed a way out. But there was no way out. Not anymore. Holt stood up. Get some rest, she said. Tomorrow, we figure out what's next. Cross let out a bitter laugh. Tomorrow, he muttered. I might not make it till then. Holt didn't respond. She just walked toward the door, checked the locks, then sat down at the table, watching him like a hawk. Cross leaned back against the couch, his body aching, his mind racing. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now, he was a dead man walking. And the worst part? He deserved it. Every time Cross closed his eyes, he saw Maya Sloane lying on the pavement, blood pooling beneath her. He heard the gunshot, heard the mayor's scream. He was trapped in a loop, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. When dawn finally crept through the grimy windows of the safe house, he sat up, groaning as his ribs protested. Holt was still at the table, sipping from a styrofoam cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Cross rubbed his face, his head pounding. Tell me we have a plan. Holt didn't look at him. We need to get you out of the city. Cross exhaled sharply. And go where? You think Sloane doesn't have people everywhere? Holt finally met his eyes. We don't have a choice. Cross clenched his jaw. We, he muttered. Don't act like you're in this with me, Holt. Holt narrowed her eyes. I just threw my career away saving your ass, she said. I'm in it now. Cross leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. He didn't trust her, not completely, but she was right. She had made a choice, and now they were both in the crosshairs. Fine, he muttered. What's the move? Holt set her coffee down. There's a man, Elias Ward, used to be a fixer for some dirty cops before he disappeared. Cross frowned. Disappeared? Holt smirked. He disappeared himself. New identity, new life. If anyone can do the same for you, it's him. Cross exhaled slowly. And how the hell do we find him? Holt pulled out a burner phone and slid it across the table. We don't. Cross stared at the phone. It was cheap, old, something that couldn't be traced. I already sent out a feeler last night, Holt said. If he's willing to meet, we'll get a time and place soon. Cross ran a hand through his hair. It was a long shot, but it was something. Then, a knock at the door. Cross's entire body went rigid. Holt was already reaching for her gun. Silence. Then, another knock. Softer this time. Cross's heart pounded. This wasn't good. No one should know they were here. Holt motioned for him to stay put as she moved to the door. Then, pressing her ear against the metal, listening. Another knock. Then a voice. I know you're in there. Cross's breath caught in his throat. He knew that voice. Holt shot him a look. Cross's mouth went dry. William Sloane, the man who wanted him dead. Cross felt his pulse skyrocket. How the hell had Sloane found them? Holt stayed silent. She didn't open the door. Sloane sighed from the other side. I know you think you can run, he said. His voice was calm, but there was something deadly underneath it. But there's nowhere to go. No hole deep enough. Cross swallowed hard. Sloane's voice dropped lower. You have one chance, Cross. Open this door, face the consequences, and maybe I'll let you live. Cross's fingers curled into fists. He looked at Holt. Her hand was gripping her gun, but she didn't move. She was waiting for him to decide. Sloane let out a soft chuckle. I know you, Cross. You've always been a survivor, but you need to understand something. A pause. Then, you shot my daughter, my baby girl. Cross's chest tightened. Sloane's voice turned cold. You don't get to survive this. Silence. Then, a scrape. A shadow moved under the door. Sloane was sliding something inside. Cross frowned. Then he saw it. A phone. The same phone Maya had dropped the night he shot her. Cross's breath caught the video. He locked eyes with Holt. Sloane's voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "Watch it, Cross." Then, footsteps, fading, and then silence. Cross's entire body was stiff. Holt waited a few more seconds before picking up the phone. She turned it over in her hands. It was on. Cross felt like he couldn't breathe. Holt sat back down and placed the phone between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Holt pressed play. And everything changed. The screen flickered to life. The video was shaky but clear enough. Cross saw himself, standing in Langford Park, gun raised. He saw Maya. He saw the exact moment she reached for her pocket. Cross's breath hitched. He had been so sure, so damn sure. But then, his stomach dropped. Maya wasn't reaching for a gun. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was reaching for a badge. Cross's mind spun. No, that's not possible. But it was right there on the screen. Maya was pulling out a small silver badge. His heart felt like it stopped. A mayor's identification badge. Not a gun, not a threat. She had been trying to show him who she was, and he had shot her for it. Cross's hands shook. Holt was staring at the screen, her face unreadable. Cross felt like he was going to be sick. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Sloane had known. That's why he left the phone. That's why he wanted Cross to see. Cross hadn't just shot an unarmed black girl. He had shot the wrong one. And now, the man who ran the city was going to make sure he paid. Holt slowly turned to look at him. Cross felt cold all over. There was no way out of this. Not anymore. Cross stared at the screen, his body frozen, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The truth was right there, playing out in front of him. Maya Sloane hadn't just been some random girl walking through the park that night. She had been trying to show him who she was, and he had shot her for it. The sickening realization made his stomach twist. He had thought, no, assumed, she was reaching for something dangerous. But it had been a badge, her father's badge. The daughter of the most powerful man in the city had tried to identify herself, and he had gunned her down anyway. Cross clenched his jaw, bile rising in his throat. The room was silent, the weight of the truth settling over them like a suffocating fog. Holt finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. "Well," she muttered, "guess that settles it." Cross swallowed hard, his mind spiraling. This doesn't change anything," he said. Even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. Holt scoffed. "Doesn't change anything?" She shook her head in disbelief. "Are you serious right now?" Cross ran a hand through his hair, fingers trembling. "I didn't know, Holt. I thought you thought." Holt's voice sharpened. "You didn't know, and you shot her anyway." Cross exhaled shakily, his head pounding. His entire body felt like it was caving in on itself. Holt sat back, arms crossed, studying him. "Tell me something," she said. "If that had been a white girl reaching for something, would you have fired that fast?" Cross's jaw locked. "Don't lie to me," Holt added coldly, "because we both know the answer." Cross didn't respond, because he already knew the truth. And that truth was damning. His breath came heavier, his pulse erratic, his mind screaming for a way out, some way, anyway, to make this situation less of a nightmare. But there was no way to twist this, no way to spin it. The video had sealed his fate. Sloane knew it. Holt knew it. And now, so did Cross. His entire body tensed as a horrifying realization settled in. Sloane hadn't come here to kill him. Not yet. No, the mayor had done something far worse. He had let him see it, let him feel it. The guilt, the shame. The slow-burning horror of knowing exactly what he had done. This wasn't just revenge. This was punishment. Cross's breathing hitched, his hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. Holt leaned forward slightly, watching him. "So," she said, "what are you going to do now?" Cross exhaled sharply, his throat dry. What could he do? He could run, disappear, let Holt's fixer set him up with a new identity, a new life. But even if he made it out of Brookstead alive, he'd never be free. Because this wouldn't just go away. The video would be released, the city would see it, and they would never stop looking for him. Cross squeezed his eyes shut, his mind racing. He had spent years enforcing his version of justice. Now, justice was coming for him. He could hear Sloane's voice in his head, low, quiet, filled with ice. "You don't get to survive this." Cross opened his eyes. There was only one thing left to do, His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I need to talk to Sloane." Holt blinked. "Are you insane?" Cross met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Maybe." Holt shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "You think he's going to talk? He wants you dead, Cross." Cross inhaled deeply, his ribs aching with every breath. "I know." Holt stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a bitter laugh. "Wow," she muttered. "For the first time in your life, you actually get it." Cross didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew. There was no escaping this. No fixing it, no running. The only way out of this mess was straight through the fire. And if Sloane wanted him dead, then so be it. Holt stared at him like he had lost his damn mind. "You want to talk to Sloane?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "This man has every cop, every street enforcer, and half the damn city looking to put you in the ground. And you want to walk into his office?" Cross leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his ribs screaming in protest. But the pain didn't matter. None of it did. He had made his decision. "I shot his daughter," he said, his voice hollow. "I need to face him." Holt let out a humorless laugh. "You need to survive, Cross. What part of that don't you get?" Cross shook his head. "You don't understand." Holt's brows furrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Cross clenched his jaw, his mind working through the pieces. "If you wanted me dead," he said slowly, "I'd already be in a body bag." Holt scoffed. "You sure about that?" Cross exhaled sharply. "He left me that phone." His throat tightened. "He wanted me to see the video, to know what I did." He swallowed hard. "He doesn't just want revenge." His voice was almost a whisper. "He wants me to feel it." Holt leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. "And then what?" she muttered. "You think if you say you're sorry, he's just going to let you go?" Cross didn't answer. Because he already knew the truth. Sloane wasn't done with him yet. Cross shook his head. "No, but I don't think this is about letting me go." Holt studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over her face. "You are out of your goddamn mind." Cross managed a small, bitter smirk. "Yeah, well, took me long enough to realize it." Holt shook her head, exhaling. "All right. Say I don't shoot you myself for being stupid. How do you plan on getting to Sloane? You think you can just walk into City Hall?" Cross leaned forward. "No, but I think I know where he'll be." Holt raised a brow. "And where's that?" Cross exhaled. "The hospital." Silence. Holt frowned. Cross continued. "Maya is still alive, and if there's one place Sloane won't leave, it's her bedside." Holt pressed her lips into a thin line. "You're betting your life on that." Cross gave her a cold, tired look. "I already lost my life, Holt." She didn't argue, because they both knew he was right. Getting into the hospital wasn't going to be easy. By now, the place would be swarming with cops, security, and Sloane's people. If Cross walked in through the front doors, he'd be dead before he reached the elevator. But Holt had a plan, or at least half of one. They needed an entry point no one would be watching, a way to get Cross inside without setting off alarms. The hospital had 3 main entrances, all heavily guarded, but Holt knew a back way, a service tunnel beneath the building, used for emergency deliveries and medical waste disposal. It wasn't pretty, but it was their best shot. Cross pulled a stolen hoodie over his head, wincing as his ribs protested. He wasn't in any shape for this. But pain didn't matter anymore. He was walking straight into the lion's den. Either he was coming out with some kind of resolution, or not at all. The tunnel was damp, the air thick with the stench of antiseptic and rot. Holt led the way, moving quickly but cautiously. The underground path was rarely used except by hospital staff, which meant no cops, no guards, just silence. Cross's heart pounded. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of what came after, afraid of facing Maya, of seeing what he had done with his own eyes, afraid of hearing her voice, if she could even still speak. Holt stopped at a steel door, pulling out a stolen security badge. She swiped it through the scanner, a soft beep. Then, click, the door unlocked. Holt shot Cross a look. Last chance to run. Cross swallowed. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. The hospital hallway was quiet, too quiet. They had entered through the lower level, away from the chaos above. But Cross felt the tension in the air. Upstairs, Sloane was waiting, and Cross was walking straight toward him. Holt moved beside him, her hand resting near the gun tucked under her jacket. "If this goes sideways," she muttered, "I'm not dying for you." Cross nodded. "I don't expect you to." They reached the service elevator. Holt pressed the button. Cross exhaled, his fingers twitched. This was it. The doors slid open. They stepped inside. Cross pressed the button for the IU floor. Holt shifted beside him. "You got a plan?" Cross let out a slow breath. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning." Holt eyed him. "And what's that?" Cross looked up as the elevator doors closed. "I'm going to face the truth." The elevator hummed softly as it climbed toward the ICU floor. But to Cross, it sounded like a war drum. His heart pounded in his chest. Each second felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Holt stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The gun tucked beneath her jacket was a reminder. She was still deciding if she was going to let this play out or put a bullet in him if things went sideways. Cross didn't blame her. He was still figuring out if he deserved to make it out of this alive. Ding! The elevator doors slid open. The hospital hallway was dimly lit. The soft beeping of machines echoed from nearby rooms. But Cross barely noticed, because standing at the end of the hall was him. William Sloan, the mayor. Sloan stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't alone. Two men in suits, bodyguards, flanked him. Their eyes locked onto Cross the moment he stepped out of the elevator. The tension in the air was suffocating. Cross forced himself forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. Sloan didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Holt stayed close, her fingers twitching near her gun. When Cross was only a few feet away, Sloan finally spoke. "You've got some nerve." His voice was calm. Too calm. Cross swallowed. His throat was dry. "I had to see her." Sloan let out a quiet chuckle. Low, bitter. "You had to?" He took a slow step forward. "You think you deserve that?" Cross said nothing. Sloan's jaw clenched. "You shot my daughter." Cross inhaled sharply. "I know." Sloan's eyes burned with a fury so controlled it was terrifying. "And now you're here," he said. "What are you looking for?" Cross's stomach twisted. "No," he said honestly. "I don't expect forgiveness." Sloan stared at him, his face unreadable. "Then why are you here?" Cross exhaled slowly. "Because I need to face this." He hesitated. "I need to see her." His voice dropped lower. "And I need you to look me in the eye when you decide what happens next." Sloan tilted his head slightly, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Cross knew exactly what he was asking for. If Sloan wanted him dead, he wouldn't run. He'd accept it. Because for the first time in his life, he knew he deserved it. Silence stretched between them. Then finally, Sloan turned slightly and motioned toward the door beside him. Cross's breath caught in his throat. Maya's room. He hesitated. Sloan's voice was like ice. "You want to face this?" He nodded toward the door. "Then go ahead." Cross's hands curled into fists at his sides. Then, without another word, he stepped past Sloan and into the room. The machines beeped softly. The air smelled sterile, cold. And there, lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to IVs and monitors, was her, Maya. Cross's chest tightened painfully. She looked small, fragile, but she was alive. He took a slow step forward, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like an avalanche. He had done this. He had put her here. Maya stirred slightly. Her eyes fluttered open. Cross froze. Her gaze landed on him, unfocused at first, then recognition. And something else. Pain. Cross's throat tightened. "Maya." Her lips parted, dry and cracked. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Cross took another step closer. "I'm sorry," he breathed, his voice breaking. "God, I'm so..." Maya blinked slowly. Then, in a weak, rasping voice, she spoke. "You were going to kill me." Cross felt the words like a knife to his chest. He shook his head. "I didn't know." Maya's expression didn't change. "I told you," she whispered. "I tried to tell you." Cross squeezed his eyes shut. The guilt was suffocating. He had been so certain, so sure that night, and he had been wrong. Maya swallowed, her throat dry. "But you didn't ask." Cross opened his mouth, but no words came out, because she was right. He hadn't asked. He had assumed. And because of that, she had almost died. Cross's breath shuddered. He felt raw, exposed. Maya's voice was barely audible, but the weight of her words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. "You saw what you wanted to see." Cross's hands trembled, because deep down, he knew it was true. For the first time in his life, Cross truly saw himself. And he hated what he saw. A racist, a coward, a man who had nearly killed an innocent girl because of his own blind prejudice. Tears burned at the edges of his eyes. His voice cracked. "I can't take it back." Maya closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with pity. And somehow, that was worse. Cross swallowed hard. Then, he turned away. He couldn't do this. He couldn't face her. His legs shook as he moved toward the door. When he stepped back into the hallway, Sloane was still standing there, watching. Cross met his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Cross took a slow breath. And he knelt. Right there. In front of the mayor. In front of the guards. In front of Holt. He sank to his knees, because there was nothing else left to do. Sloane didn't move. Didn't speak. Cross closed his eyes. If Sloane wanted to end this, if he wanted to pull a gun and put a bullet in him, he wouldn't fight it. Then, finally Sloane spoke. His voice was quiet. Dangerous. You kneel now? A bitter laugh. After everything? Cross stayed silent. Sloane exhaled, shaking his head. Then, he turned to Holt. Get him out of my sight. Cross's eyes flickered open. Sloane's gaze was cold, but there was something else there, something undecided. Cross swallowed hard. This wasn't over. Not yet. Sloane hadn't decided his fate, and that was terrifying. Holt grabbed Cross's arm, yanking him up. Let's go, she muttered. Cross let her lead him away. His legs barely worked as they moved down the hall. His mind raced. He had faced the truth. He had faced her. But the question still remained. What the hell was Sloane going to do with him now? Cross leaned against the cold concrete wall, his body heavy, his ribs aching with every breath. Sloane hadn't killed him. That should have meant something. But somehow, it felt worse than if he had, because Sloane wasn't letting him go. He was waiting. For what? Cross had no idea. Holt checked the hallway, making sure they weren't being followed. We need to get out of here, she muttered, before he changes his mind. Cross didn't move. You think he will? Holt hesitated. Then, I don't know. Cross exhaled slowly. For the first time since that night, he felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man with no future. He glanced at Holt. Why didn't he kill me? Holt's jaw tightened. Maybe because death would have been too easy. Cross swallowed hard. She was right. If Sloane had wanted him dead, he wouldn't have walked out of that hospital. But Sloane wanted something else, something worse. Cross pushed off the wall, forcing himself to move. Let's go. Holt nodded, leading the way as they disappeared into the tunnels. Cross knew one thing for certain. His life as he knew it was over. And whatever came next was entirely in Sloane's hands. Sloane stood in the dim hospital room, watching the steady rise and fall of Maya's chest. His daughter was alive. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Not yet. He had seen Cross break in front of him, seen the weight of his own guilt crush him. But that wasn't justice. Not yet. Sloane needed more. He needed Cross to suffer. He needed the whole world to see what he had done. A soft knock sounded at the door. Sloane didn't turn. A voice, low, steady, spoke from the doorway. We have it ready. Sloane finally looked up. Adrian Voss's replacement stood in the shadows. Sloane nodded once. The man pulled out a phone, tapped the screen, and then the video began to upload. Sloane exhaled slowly. Randall Cross had thought he could outrun his sins, but now the world was about to see him for what he truly was. And this time, there would be no escape.